Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each Saturday live, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific on Contact Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. This is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. And today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. First of all, I want you all to know that I'm not doing any free readings today, so I apologize for that, but we'll be back next week for that. I have the great honor today to have a wonderful guest on instead of the typical show. It's going to be an exciting discussion with my friend Tad Mann, who is an author, an astrologer, an architect, an artist. He's a man of many, many talents and has published numerous books on astrology and has actually been a real trailblazer with regard to the science of astrology and sort of advancing it further with new methodologies as well as interpretive methods for how the chart is discovered. And his knowledge is quite deep and quite profound with regard to the amount of data that he can pull out of a chart. So his books are incredibly rich with information about the astrology chart in general. So I encourage you to find his books. His books are either published under the name of A.T. Mann or Tad Mann. So A.T.M.A.N.N. is his name on the web. If you go to Amazon, you'll find numerous books on astrology there. My particular favorite one is one of the ones he's written years ago that I refer to all the time. And his approach to astrology is very different. But we're talking to him today in a different capacity. Even though this is a show about astrology, it's also a show about art. Tad Mann is also a mandala artist, and he's an architect, and he's an astrologer. It's almost as if he went through the whole list of occupations that began with A and took them. He's author, astrologer, architect, artist, and he's got those all nailed down, and he's quite prolific in that regard. He has a mandala calendar that has just been released, that will be released for 2011, and his website is atmann.net. MANN.net. He is a very highly regarded in the world of architecture as well as astrology. But this time we're talking about a book that he is just about to publish called Sacred Landscapes, The Threshold Between Worlds. And he has created all the text for it in conjunction with a woman named Lynn Davis, who has provided the photographs. And this is a book that's coming out on Sterling Publishing. It's a beautiful discussion of sacred landscapes, and this is what we're going to be discussing today, sort of what makes a landscape sacred, where in the world are these positions, and how do you identify them? These are some of the questions I want to get out of Tad today in this conversation. So Tad, welcome to Turning of the Wheel.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah. It's been a while. You were actually my very first guest about 3 years ago, and so it's interesting to have you back here in a whole new format with a new book of yours coming out.
Absolutely. Yes, I'm very excited about it.
Now, this work has been underway for quite some time. I remember you telling me about this, about a year ago you had started work on this project.
Actually, it's quite a lot longer than that because, some books take a long time to be generated. And I first had an idea to do a book that I called Sacred Gardens 20 years ago, believe it or not. I moved to Denmark in 1991, and I had this idea that it was really about the landscape, but I called it Sacred Gardens. And, I wrote various proposals. I tried to get it published unsuccessfully, and finally I moved back to the U.S. 10 years ago. And about 8 or 9 years ago, I met Lynn Davis, who's a very well-known photographer, who's a neighbor of mine and a great friend. And along the way, I got her intrigued by the whole idea because she's essentially a landscape photographer. And we decided to collaborate on the book, which is to be launched this coming Thursday on the 7th of October in New York.
And it's interesting because bringing in photography, of course, makes it a very visual representation, which, of course, when you're talking about landscapes, I guess is a necessary component. But prior to that, your approach was going to be based on what? When you talked about the idea of sacred gardens, was it going to be something that you were going to create as an artist?
Well, it's funny because I've just written a follow-up book called The Language of the Sacred Trees, and in that book I've actually included a number of my drawings and paintings from years ago. But what basically you imagine a book and you think of images that go with it well before you actually know what those images actually are. Mm-hmm. And of course it changes it completely, or changed it completely, because Lynn's images are very particular. They're very abstract. They're very unusual images in the sense that they're not just great photographs, but they're amazing art as well. And they're considered in New York, where her primary gallery is, to be, the peak of the avant-garde. So it's actually very interesting because she's abstracted a lot of the principles which I talk about in those terms in the Sacred Landscape book.
And so in order to be a landscape photographer, the first person that comes to mind is someone along the lines of Ansel Adams, who's shooting large areas, large bulks of, area. You're not shooting, still life, you're shooting huge areas. So I imagine she must have a particular slant on photography that is along those lines. Is that a good visual representation for people listening? Is the idea?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, since the late 80s, she's been to, I believe it's something in the region of 70 different countries on virtually every continent. And she's basically been drawn to sacred places, although, her actual body of work is much larger than that. I mean, she had a book published, I think, 2 years ago about space. And essentially, she went all of the places on the planet where the original space shots were done and photographed the remains of the superstructures they used to launch them.
Wow.
Places like Kazakhstan and in one of the new Russian republics. Similarly, there's the European space launch. I think they all happened from somewhere in, off the coast of South America, as well as Cape Canaveral.
Yeah.
But it's, her range of work is very broad, but most of it has actually been sacred landscapes and sacred places.
So this is a very interesting concept, because I think the most obvious question anyone would ask is, what makes a place sacred? What is it? What are the defining characteristics? Now, I mean, for the outside observer such as myself, I would say, well, maybe Angkor Wat would be the place, Machu Picchu, sort of those big things that we think of as spiritual places. But I'm sure that this is a much broader area. And I'm curious what's the criteria for making a spot sacred, per se?
That's a very interesting question, because that's, of course, what much of the book is about. One of my approaches to it was that sacred places are places where people go, and regardless of their belief system, their religion, their psychology, and so on, they feel that the place is special, and that very often it transforms them in some way. Throughout history, there have been places that are also seen as places of origin. It's like, there's actually a chapter in the book called Mythic Sacred Landscapes, which is about places like the Garden of Eden, or Atlantis, or Shambhala, or Shangri-La. But the point of it is that the earliest cultures considered places sacred where the gods and the goddesses resided. And for example, one of the clearest examples are sacred mountains. And in almost all early cultures, one of the earliest symbols was actually an upward pointing triangle, which symbolized the element fire, but it also symbolized ascent and the sacred. So sacred mountains, in particular, the highest mountains in any given area, were considered that way because it was believed that the gods came down to earth by the sacred mountain. And similarly, by reflection, that if you wanted to come into contact with the sacred, you went up into the mountain. I mean, Moses is a very good example of that. Went up into the mountain to retrieve the tablets of the law. You find that in almost every religion, in almost every culture, there are legends about a figure who retrieved or had some kind of contact with the gods, went up into the mountains. Zarathustra, in
Right.
Nietzsche's book was all about going up into the mountains, finding sacred knowledge, bringing it down to earth, trying to ground it, and then often going back into the mountains again. So it's also a process. It's like a psychological or spiritual process of trying to achieve enlightenment, but then to bring it back down to earth in some way.
So it's a metaphorical, even in that regard, because the mountain does serve as a way of getting closer to heavens, or the heavens per se. So that I guess the closer you get to them, the greater the conduit of knowledge would be.
Possibly, yeah. I would say that in the beginning it was seen in a kind of symbolic way. Then it probably went through a period of time where it was seen quite literally, meaning the mountain was kind of respected because you could see it from everywhere. Think of Mount Fuji,
right?
In Japan, which is an object of art. It's a place where where Zen masters went to meditate. It's a place where people looked and felt the sacred. So it's interesting because what happens is it gets abstracted. In the beginning, it's an actual mountain, but then it can be, by extension, be any mountain. It can be any triangular mound in your garden. Very often Zen gardens have little sacred mountains in them, configurations of rocks. Similarly, the Great Pyramid is a sacred mountain. Or a stupa. In the East, a stupa is a kind of sacred place, and it signals and marks a particular spot. You could even say something like the Washington Monument is a sacred spot, symbolizing a sacred mountain, or the Acropolis, which is a sacred mountain, even though it's kind of chopped off at the top and isn't very high, it performs the same kind of function.
Yeah, it's that sort of that heightened levity of the object being closer to the heavens, reaching upward in an effort to expand. It's sort of that outreach.
Exactly, but it comes to symbolize ascent psychologically and spiritually, and the implication is that in the beginning they are literally mountains, but then they become much broader in application. I mean, I use as examples when you talked about Angkor Wat. I use the gateways at Angkor Wat are sacred mountains essentially because they're surmounted by Buddhas that are roughly triangular in shape. But there's another quality which is associated with the sacred, which I call gateways, meaning there are certain entryways that look as though they're boundaries, that if you pass through them, that you enter a sacred territory. So at Angkor Wat, these gateways perform two functions. They symbolize a sacred mountain because they have a Buddha on top of them, actually 4 Buddhas facing to the cardinal directions, but they're also gateways because they're entrances into a sacred territory. And the gist of the book, I think, is really very interesting because in early cultures, essentially the whole world was sacred. The sky was sacred, the earth was sacred, mountains were, rivers were because they flowed, because they provided water, nature was sacred because it provided food, and various other things. But what happened gradually over time, especially with the coming of Western civilization, is for example, that, in Christianity or Islam or Judaism, that when you suddenly create a temple or a mosque or a church, and you surround it with a gateway, and you say essentially that this is sacred territory, what happens is that everything around it ceases being sacred. So in fact, what happened is that by making specific sacred places, the patriarchal religions made the rest of the world, in fact, they desacralized the world. So one of the aims of this book is to try to restore that sense of the sacred to people, and so that we can all look at it and see the various places, the various symbols, the various images that signal to us that something's sacred.
So by putting that delineation up there of a barrier for lack of a better word, by saying this spot is sacred, so therefore anything outside of that spot is not sacred. They literally put up a border that sort of contained the spirituality and limited it.
Right, and it cuts it off from the common person.
Mm-hmm.
Until following on that logic, by the time the scientific revolution happens in the last 300 or 400 years, that nature is essentially the next step of its desacralization happens, where nature is simply seen as a raw material to be exploited.
Mm-hmm.
And forget it. You don't care about whether it's sacred or not. You just simply take advantage of the raw materials. You exploit them. You don't even think about it because it's not a churchyard and it's not a mosque. So part of this book is really about trying to return that sense of the sacred. And I think that happens by learning more about what constitutes a sacred place and what actually happens in those sacred places. And it's very, very interesting because people who have read early versions of this book have been quite shocked to realize that places that they know in their back garden or in their local town, things like sacred trees, like how many little villages in England have a sacred oak in the main courtyard of the city or the main square of the city. Basically, there are sacred objects all around us. We just have to learn to recognize them and extend it to include the rivers and the mountains and the seas and everything like that.
Mm-hmm. What I like about it is this sense of universality. I think it is the most compelling piece to me because inherent in these sacred places, there is no dogma, there is no anything attached to it. It's sort of universal to all mankind, and I think that's the most compelling piece of it to me because when you break down and you traverse those barriers that are often put in place by traditional religions, you've opened it up to the whole panorama of humanity, which is much broader and much more enriching.
Well, absolutely. In the news yesterday on NPR, they actually mentioned a sacred site in, I think it's in Pakistan or near the Pakistan border, where it's both an Islamic and a Hindu sacred site. And there's been so much bloodshed.
Oh, right.
That they decided to split it up 1/3, 2/3, which is really absurd in a way, because another phenomenon that the book discusses is that ancient sacred places very often have been captured by subsequent religions and taken over. It's like
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Chartres Cathedral, in France, west of Paris, was originally a sacred place to the Black Goddess, the Dark Virgin. And this means that it was really based on kind of matriarchal cultures. In ancient times, thousands of years ago, it had actually natural springs around it that early people doused and used, and it was probably a place of worship for 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 years before a cathedral was built there in 1100. So what happens is that there's a lot of architecture in the book as well, because that architecture has grown up, and it ends up, to me, kind of not only symbolizing, but also it kind of accentuates and exaggerates that sacred quality. But I think it's important to remember the original legends and stories that grew up around these sites.
Yeah, and you think about it, when you mention architecture and you mention cathedrals, I mean, the whole purpose of the steeples in the cathedrals is toward this outreach towards it has the same symbolism as the mountain has when you have this,
exactly. Well,
this reaching.
Are actually sacred mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way, there's another dynamic that describes the sacred are caves.
Caves, right?
In the same way that mountains ascend up, they're very masculine, they're a bit phallic in a way, that caves, of course, are the reverse.
They're maternal, right.
They don't move towards the light, they move down towards the darkness. They represent places where initiation happens. It's like going back into the womb.
It's very much like, I was just going to say, it's very maternal. It has a womb-like cloistered effect where you have a sense of security because you are surrounded by this cave-like. So it is the exact opposite. You're right about that. Yeah?
That's absolutely right. So we get the cave is a kind of maternal and feminine quality, which represents the unconscious world, the underground, the world of death, the world of the unconscious, just as the sacred mountain symbolizes heaven, And so we get this motif, which shows up in a lot of my other books, in Sacred Architecture, Sacred Sexuality, as well as my astrology, which is that sacred places also come about where heaven and earth meet.
Mm-hmm.
So things like trees, their branches ascend up into heaven, but the roots go down into the underworld, into hell, as it were. And so a lot of these sacred places not only go up, but they also go down.
Yeah, well, trees serve as a bridge in that regard, because they do encompass the upward reach towards the sky, towards the heavens, but they are also grounded in the earth, which gives them that sense of permanence and stature. So that gives them that structure.
That's
and
right.
And when you mentioned the idea of the maternal ideas of the caves, this also brings up another piece of who you are as an artist, which is based on the mandalas. And the mandalas, to me, I see as very much as a maternal kind of quality as well, because they are a circular container typically, and within that container, there's no hard edges. I mean, the mandalas obviously have hard edges, but I'm saying that in their form, they are a representation of the subconscious, and they have that quality about them, which is very similar to what we're talking about here.
Sure. Well, in that sense, the calendar you mentioned before, the 2011 mandala calendar, is really 12 religious systems, all of which are characterized by symbols, mandalas, that are squares and circles. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, the circle is kind of masculine and corresponds to spirit, and the square corresponds to the feminine and represents the physical world. So once again, you get this interesting contrast, and some places have 2 or 3 or 4 of the sacred symbols. It's like the Great Pyramid is simultaneously a sacred mountain, but the caves within it represent sacred caves.
Mm-hmm.
Another principle is orientation, when things are oriented north, south, east, and west. And, for example, an interesting point I make in the book is that Tibetan Buddhist mythology and religion states that there are 4 sacred directions, each of which has its own sacred mountain, and they're 4 colors. They're black, red, yellow, and white. And the interesting thing is that the Native American cultures in the West, the Navajo in particular, have, guess what? 4 sacred mountains in the cardinal directions with exactly the same colors associated with them.
Mm-hmm. How do those colors translate to astrology, for example? Obviously I would think red would be fire, but is there a direct correlation there?
It's very simple. They don't. Although you could say that they represent the 4 cardinal signs, but they, as you know, in the East, the correspondence of elements is very different than it is in the West.
Right. Yeah.
Although the principle behind it is the same thing, the colors vary a little bit. But what's interesting is that there's no known direct connection between, for example, Tibet and the far west of the U.S. However, when the Dalai Lama first went to Mexico, or New Mexico, and saw some of the Navajo sacred places, he met some of the elders of these Native American tribes, and they looked the same.
Mm-hmm.
They had the same pieces of turquoise.
Mm.
They actually agreed that they were brothers. So one other part of the book that I found very fascinating in the research is that I track down the myths and legends that are associated with these primal places. And almost all of them, as I said before, the centers of these series of sacred mountains and so on are almost always places where the world began. And the stories behind the places where the world began are the same almost everywhere in the world. And it's a totally fascinating study.
How do you identify places where the world began? Is that dictated by, say, the presence of a volcano? Is there some sort of geographic component that identifies these beginning places?
Funny you mention it, because what do you think a volcano is? A volcano is a sacred mountain that has a vertical cave that goes down into it. And it's also a place that spreads fire. And it also often has lava flows around it. And flow is another one of the chapters in the book, which is that's another significant sacred quality. And we get things like the volcano, therefore, has the sacred mountain symbolism. It has the cave symbolism. It has flow. And the fire, they believe, was what created the world. So it's quite natural that volcanic places, like Bali, in Bali, there are two sacred mountains, each of which are considered to be, well, one of them is considered to be the center of the world and the place where the world began. Similarly, near Borobudur in Java, where I was a couple of years ago, there are a circle of 4 volcanoes. And, again, the people in Eastern Java believe that that's where the world began. So what we see really is that there are places where the world began all over the place. And as you said before, it cuts across these cultures. When you go to these places, regardless of what your religious beliefs, regardless of your practice spiritually, or whether you have one or not, you can't help but be transformed by going to them. And that's partially, but that's primarily what I love about these places.
Yeah, there's a very primal quality that resonates, that transcends any sort of religious problem and gets it back to the basic place. But you think about the idea of a volcano. A volcano literally is the creation of something new. So just even on a very physical place, I mean, an underwater volcano literally creates land as it's born, and islands were created that way. And so it is the essence of creativity.
Yeah, exactly. Like in Australia, the sacred place, or the most sacred place, although the Aboriginals have an amazing vision of the sacred. They believe that a sacred place is a series of stories about the events that have actually happened there, going back to the earliest times. But a place called Ayers Rock, Uluru,
yes, yeah.
also in the center of Australia, is a huge red sandstone mountain, essentially, with no mountains around it within hundreds and hundreds of miles. What is said about it geographically is that it's really the residue or the remains of a whole mountain chain, and it's the only one left.
Yeah, got worn down.
So what it's actually symbolizing is it is symbolizing a process that happened hundreds of millions of years ago. And there's another quality about such sacred places is they convey ancient time, but they also convey timelessness.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. It really is.
Behold these places. When we go to them, then suddenly we pass over. That's why I call it crossing the threshold. Is that when we go to such places, we cross this threshold from our mundane, time-bound reality into something that's beyond time. It's beyond our lives. It kind of inspires us to extend our reach, to really be more than we actually are as discrete individuals. So I think there's a profound lesson to be learned from these places. And as evidence, we all travel all over the world to go to such places.
Yeah, they certainly are compelling, and they have a magnetism to them, literally, probably figuratively as well, about how they draw us. We're speaking today, my guest today, you're listening to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher, and we're speaking today with Tad Mann about his latest book called Sacred Landscapes, The Threshold Between Worlds. We're going to take a quick break right now and come back, and I want to ask some more questions specifically about identifying sacred landscapes and to get further into this topic. And it's a remarkable story. Tad is an accomplished author, astrologer, architect, and artist, and his new book is called Sacred Landscapes. It's on Sterling Publishing, and it's going to be coming out this week and should be available in bookstores very soon. The official title of it is called Sacred Landscapes, The Threshold Between Worlds by A.T. Mann and photography by Lynn Davis. It's on Sterling Publishing Company. It should be out this coming week. We'll be back in about 2.5 minutes with more interesting questions about this fascinating topic, which I think has an element to it that is quite profound with regard to how mankind fits into the planet of the Earth as we are right now. So we'll be right back in about 2.5 minutes.
What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today. Or call me, 978-264-0668. That's 978-264-0668. www.chrisflisher.com.
Did you know that you can rate this show on iTunes? The show you're listening to right now. It's true. You can leave your thoughts about the show, the topic, the guest. You can even leave a suggestion. Then, before you leave, rate the show. The hosts love hearing from you, so next time you download this show from iTunes, leave your thoughts and rate the show for the host and for others.
As the world shrinks and our barriers come down, diverse cultures are striving for harmony, balance, and peace. To ease the transition, we need to expand with color, light, and tolerance. Now, you can become a global citizen and embrace the color and clear spirit with the divine artwork of the mandala. Mandalas are a timeless artistic offering for creating unity, harmony, and peace. My name is Chris Flisher, and I've spent years creating mandalas, and they are now available online at www.chrisflisher.com. Come and experience the world of color, form, and function with t-shirts, coffee mugs, note cards, and limited edition prints. These vibrant, lively paintings and products express optimism, oneness, and spiritual balance for all who use them. At www.chrisflisher.com. www.chrisflisher.com, and enter a world of possibility and color.
Welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. This is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. And my guest today is the one and only Tad Mann, who has just completed a fascinating book called Sacred Landscapes. Now, Tad is just trained as an architect. He's an astrologer. He's an author. He's an artist. And he has a very broad scope of all of these modalities and how they all intermingle, which to me, I think actually holds the key to sort of what I call divine logic as to the creation of the planet and why we all exist. And all these components, which we have always studied sort of in their own separate world, really have a synergy between them, which is cohesive and can come together in this way. So in the concept of a sacred landscape, we have a physical place on the earth that brings into account the basic human qualities of recognition, because we all recognize these places as being sacred. There's a sense of commonality there. There's a sense of oneness there. There's a sense of humanity that transcends any religious dogma or belief system, and it is universal. And they are symbolic in the fact that they reach towards the sky in the sense of ascension. They reach into the earth in the sense of the great mother, the maternal quality. So they have elements about them which are universal to all people, and that's why they are considered sacred. Now, Tad, what I'm curious about is when you went about photographing and deciding these places, what was the criteria for finding these? Obviously, I think the average person would think of the typical spots on the earth as being sacred, but I think your scope is far broader than that. And I'm wondering what was your criteria and how you decided where these landscapes were.
Well, they exist all over the place. is the long and the short answer to that. Mm-hmm. And this is, of course, one of the qualities. It's not like they're inaccessible to the average person. For example, there are sacred places in the Northeast of America, which is where I live, around the Hudson River Valley, that are really very, very special, but you'd never know it. There's a stone circle in New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. All kinds of Neolithic places that have been marked by standing stones in Ohio and Illinois and Indiana. Mm-hmm. In fact, there are sacred places all over the U.S., for example, as well as in Mexico, South America, Canada. It's very, very interesting because when you begin really exploring it, you discover that, they're not like, you don't have to travel all the way around the world to get to these places, but that they exist on almost every continent. Now, it's funny because over the years, I've traveled a lot. I lived out of the U.S. for more than 30 years. I lived in England for almost 20 years, in Denmark for 9 years, and I've traveled extensively all over the world. And one of the things I always do is when I go somewhere unique and unusual, I try to find an equivalent sacred place there. Simply because to me it represents a kind of pilgrimage. It opens my mind. It opens my spirit. And I do find that over the years that I've just simply accumulated images in my mind or in my spirit of places that have really resonated with me. And it's interesting because when Lynn and I first started talking about this book, it turned out that a lot of the places I considered to be sacred were places she had already photographed. She didn't go and photograph anything for the book itself. Rather, she allowed me very gratefully access to her archives of pictures over the years.
Oh, yeah.
So I was able to, after writing the book, I went through her archive of thousands and thousands of photographs. And in fact, I wasn't looking for literal illustrations. I wasn't looking for things like, she actually does have a lot of amazing pictures of Machu Picchu in the book. But there are places that she never went to, that I went to, and which I wrote about, that aren't literally illustrated, but I used her work to illustrate the principles.
I see. So you have a certain sort of, I would call it a sacred radar, for lack of a better word, where you are able to go to a spot and do you think that your sacred radar is in line with the rest of humanity with regard to what we see as sacred? And what I'm referring to are sort of the more esoteric places that aren't quite as easily identifiable as, Chartres or Stonehenge or whatever. The places that are a little bit more off the beaten path that do have sacred qualities to them. Would everyone recognize that, do you think?
By this point, I don't think there's going to be much dispute about any of the sites that I've chosen. Mm-hmm. I can't remember how many. I'll look in the book to see, because we've marked at the end of the book, we have a couple of maps that show, where all of these sacred sites are around the world. And of course, they're really, let me see here. I think, there are 15 different, and there are more than one picture of a lot of these sites, but there are 15 sacred places in North America and South America, and there are 50 places in Africa, Asia, Australia, Europe, and the Middle East. And they're fairly evenly spread over all these places. I don't think that any of these places are really, stretching the limit. I think they're all acknowledged universally as being sacred. But what I found is fascinating is that the myths and legends behind them are so similar that it's as though there's a kind of common sacred language. And that again is one of the main themes of the book as well, that it's not like something that I'm inventing. It's not something that's brand new. It's something that's been with us virtually forever. And it's always been so central to humanity that I believe that if we began to embrace the sacred, that it would really change our view of our earth and help us really reinstitute those sacred qualities, because I think it's essential. I think recycling is great.
Yeah, we certainly have more in common than we don't have in common. And so when you look at these sacred places, or even if you look at sacred religions in general, they all have basic tenets that are the same. They sort of have cornerstones that are the same. It's just that they're implemented wrong. And then it gets into this whole possessive, my religion's better than your religion kind of thing, which is creation of all the major wars in the world. But what I think that when you talk about these landscapes, because we are members of, we all own these landscapes, so to speak, because we are all citizens of the planet. And since we are all citizens of the planet, we equally own them, I suppose, on a very, very, basic level. But one of the first questions that comes to my mind with regard to this is, do you see, are these sacred landscapes, are they connected? I mean, literally, do you think that there's an underground or undercurrent connection based on, the meridians of the Earth and how the Earth is formed? Do you see any correlation to the connection of them? Is there energy flowing between them, underwater, underground, for example?
Absolutely. I mean, I talk quite a lot about all kinds, and on almost every continent there are different concepts that describe this. It could be ley lines. Mm-hmm. It can be simply energy patterns in the earth. It can be, the orientation, or it can be linkages of temples, for example. It's like in Islam, there's something called a mihrab, which exists in every mosque because the mihrab in the mosque points towards Mecca. So what's interesting is that they're always shaped like a cave. And so it's as though in every single mosque around the world, there's a cave that points towards Mecca. Mm-hmm. And these places are making us remember the kind of core of the sacred place. So again, I wish that these sacred places were something that we all owned, but actually there's a huge amount of dispute around actually who does own these places. And in many cases they've been taken over years by various cultures, used for periods of hundreds or thousands of years. And then when that culture is conquered, for example, the usage changes. It's like, and it's interesting to see that, because a lot of Christians, for example, who might not be very tolerant of other religions or consider paganism to be something that's, inherently evil somehow, would be shocked to realize that almost all churches and temples are built on land that was originally utilized as a place to worship these, kind of earlier cultures that might be considered heathen. So it's very, very interesting, because I think this book will help, if people really pay attention to it, to dissolve some of the boundaries that exist in relation to these places.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I think that's exactly one of the greater purposes of the book, to be honest with you, because and you're right about that. I took a class once on sacred geometry, and they did talk about the fact that many of the cathedrals in Europe were actually built on pagan sites, and they sort of took them over and made them their own and oriented their cathedrals right on those same spots. So they were already identified and deemed as sacred spots, and then they were reallocated based on Christianity or whoever was in charge. But the concept here of landscapes, there is something about it, and I'm curious what your take is and how it dovetails with sacred geometry, because is there a correlation between the sacred landscape and the geometry of these spaces?
Well, I believe so. And there's a chapter on orientation, for example, which is that it's a slightly more sophisticated concept, but a lot of places that were sacred were marked by early cultures in such a way that they identified the four directions. Like, one of the obvious examples is Egypt, where the Great Pyramids aligned exactly, the faces are aligned north, south, east, and west. Of course, also there are ideas like the elements that show a kind of connectedness of one type of element of the landscape and another, in the sense that, all of these places together constitute a sacred world. Any one of them can be considered sacred in their own right. Mm-hmm. But of course, when you combine more than one of them together, you do obviously get networks of such sacred places. All across Europe, I used to be a member of a group called RILCO, which I just discovered last week in England still exists. It's called the Research into Lost Knowledge Organization. And one of the things that it does is the members go and track. There's a pilgrimage path that heads across Europe and all of the churches along this path are sacred to Saint Michael, like Mont Saint-Michel, which is in the northwest of France. There are a number of Michael chapels all over England, and of course you can track all over Europe on these pilgrimage paths. There are similar pilgrimage paths in China, in Japan, in India, in Australia. In Australia, young men, when they're initiated, they go out into the world and they follow a sacred path, but no one tells them exactly where this path is or how it functions. Part of their coming to manhood is actually learning to read nature and learning to really understand how this kind of sacred process comes about. So it's a huge factor, actually, and quite a fascinating one to know about, because it's interesting. Growing up in the West, we just aren't exposed to ideas like this, and I believe that to a lot of people, this is going to be a real revelation and will kind of open people's minds, at least I hope it will, to a different way of looking at the sacred and a kind of open-mindedness to religion, spirituality, and other issues like this.
Yeah, it does remove that barrier, which is the one piece I like about it the most, because it does show a common theme that runs across. And one of the things I find fascinating is that when you look at a sacred space that it's say, for example, takes place in Australia, and then you go to a place 12,000 miles away and you see similar characteristics, that certainly speaks to the oneness of what humanity is all about.
Absolutely. And places where, like, for example, in the chapter on flow, there's quite a lengthy section because Lynn's done amazing photographs of waterfalls.
Oh, yeah.
Things like Niagara Falls. And she went, I think about 2.5 years ago to Iguazu Falls, which is it's at the border of Brazil and Argentina. And it's interesting because in researching the myths, I discovered the mythology behind Iguazu is identical to the Native American mythology behind Niagara Falls.
Yeah, I mean, so that just points out the commonality so quickly and so easily.
The African myths behind Victoria Falls. So it's fascinating because you realize that without any kind of intercommunication, that these cultures kind of naturally, I mean, one's tempted on a psychological level to say that they're archetypal in the sense that they're common. We have this common root within us that really says a lot about how we should start to look at the world in a new and healthier way.
Well, and I think that we are sort of on the cusp of a return to that. I think that from an astrological standpoint, I think that Pluto going through Capricorn really does bring us back to that spot, and it will sort of knock down some of these barriers, I think, that have been put up by man, sort of take them down so that this cross-pollination of ideas and energies can actually reinvigorate and be restored. Because I think it probably was there at one time.
I think so, and I hope so. I mean, I think that not necessarily that there was a unity at some point in the past, but I mean, in reality, the book addresses that also in the chapter on mythic sacred places, because almost every culture has a mythic sacred city that's never been discovered. Whether it's the sacred cities in Peru, or that no one has ever found, or it's Atlantis and its original site, or it's the Garden of Eden. And in fact, I start the book with the journey that I took many years ago in 1971. I hitchhiked from Europe to India, and I found myself staying the night totally by accident, looking out at Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey, right near the Iran border, which is where Noah's Ark supposedly landed,
right,
after the Great Flood. And I thought to myself, this is unbelievable. What an extraordinary place. And it felt extraordinary. It changed my thinking about things. It really opened my mind in a way, and it had a much larger effect than I could ever have imagined. And I know that when people start going to sacred places, especially with the information I've kind of have been trying to pass on to them, they'll find they appreciate such places much more, and also find that they really do feed something inside of us that's very, very powerful and potent.
Yeah, I think they are very visceral in that regard and primal. They sort of strike a nerve that transcends all kinds of race, religion, creeds, and beliefs and everything else. That's what I love about them, is that universal quality to them. When you're identifying a spot or you've come across a spot, are they typically, I guess I'm trying to get this across to people, the idea of a sacred landscape, and, things like the Grand Canyon obviously would come to mind, but on a more mundane level, like when you speak about smaller areas within our daily lives that we go to, we see as sacred spots, people would think of cemeteries perhaps as sacred because it possesses the dead. Or do they always have a sense of grandeur to them? Do they always have this sense of recognition? Is there always, or could they just be as simple as a small corner or a small tree someplace? Or do they have to have this sense of, profundity to them, I guess?
Well, no, I think some of them are very modest. It's like, a friend of mine and I stumbled across a magazine that's very obscure. I'd never seen it before. I think it's called like American Archaeology or something, but But the gist of it is that near Kingston, New York, that's about 20 miles from where I live, there's something they call the Kingston Stonehenge. And it's actually right near the parking lot of a huge corporation. We had to wind through incredibly impenetrable bush to get there. And there's standing stones, a circle of them, that are probably 10, 12, 14 feet high, that probably no one has found for decades and decades. And so, it's interesting because these sacred places very often are around us and we don't even know it, or we don't even realize it. Another interesting issue about it is that the last chapter in the book is called The Disappearing Sacred Landscape. And one of the issues that's really powerful is that, we talk about how these places exert such a strong influence and so on. But for example, the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia used to use Angkor Wat, the Buddha heads on the top, these magnificent carved stone Buddha heads, as target practice.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
They would shoot their rifles at them.
Unbelievable.
And so there's a disappearing sacred territory on the planet as well. And this is also something that I would really love to bring to people's attention, because we need to save these places, because some of them are vanishing.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point.
Lynn photographed some of the more beautiful photographs in the book are a specialty of Lynn's in recent years. She's been to Greenland a number of times and photographed icebergs that are sacred mountains.
They're disappearing too, by the way.
These sacred places, and they're disappearing. And so I think, I hope this book is a real wake-up call for people, and that it really brings to their attention the fact that we have these sacred places all around us, and it's so important that we recognize them, understand them, learn how they function, and all of these other things, because it really is a very important legacy.
Well, I think we are out of time, unfortunately, but it's been a fascinating discussion with my friend and author A.T. Mann, whose book is Sacred Landscapes, The Threshold Between Worlds, which is being published this week on Sterling Publishing. It's available through Amazon, and I thank you all for tuning in. I am afraid we are out of time. Tad, thank you so much for joining me today, and as always, be open to possibilities, as I know you are. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.chrisflisher.com. That's www.chrisflisher.com. Or email me, and you can call me at 978-264-0668. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.